Welcome back to The Strategy Show, the podcast that tries to connect real-world business events with the strategy concepts that help us to understand them. I'm Ben Dixon-Green, and today we're exploring the case study of the collapse of NCP, once the UK's largest and most recognisable car park operator. Now, even if you've never heard of NCP, don't worry. If you're in the UK, you've almost certainly seen their black and yellow branding in city centres and transport hubs and airports right across the country. If you're not in the UK, you'll probably be familiar with their counterparts in other countries like Q Park in Europe, InPark in North America, or Wilson Parking in Australia and New Zealand. NCP has recently fallen into administration in the UK, putting around 700 jobs at risk and affecting about 340 car parks. And it's interesting because it offers really a textbook example of how strategic blind spots can turn a really stable business into a failing one. Now, whether you're a strategy student, a strategy enthusiast, or really just someone who's circled one of NCP's car parks looking for a space, today's episode will try to bring these headlines to life. We're going to use NCP as a case study to show you how some of the classic frameworks like PESTEL, Porter's Five Forces, and the value chain can help us make sense of what happened and what the company might have done differently. I'm recording this podcast in 2026, but don't let that worry you if you're listening sometime after this. Strategy examples rarely go out of date. The underlying way that companies make decisions and the problems that they face are often relevant for consideration years in the future. So, first of all, let's have a look at exactly what went wrong at NCP. Because on paper, NCP looks like an absolute model of predictable, low overhead, dependable revenue. It leased most of its car parks rather than owning them. It employed relatively few staff for a company of its size, and it charged, in some cases, quite high prices, up to £65 a day, simply for providing a place to leave your car. And it had been doing this very successfully since it was set up in London way back in 1931. So what did go wrong? Well, there isn't just one reason, as is often the case for corporate problems. But NCP's situation provides a perfect kind of springboard into how strategic planning models help us make sense of sudden industry shocks and show how companies like NCP could perhaps have been able to anticipate them sooner. We're going to start with PESTEL. It's an absolutely classic tool that examined political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal issues that might impact on an organization and its strategy. Now remember, this model focuses on macroeconomic, so non-industry specific issues that might impact a company like NCP. Now, we're not going to go into every issue, otherwise we'll be here for a very long time. But we're going to look at the key issues within this model that contributed to NCP's collapse. Let's have a look at the economic issues first. Parking demand in the UK never fully recovered after the COVID pandemic. The cost of living pressures that were created then reduced the amount of discretionary trips that people made into cities, and fewer shoppers meant fewer filled spaces in NCP's car parks. At the same time, many of NCP's leases on its premises were index linked to inflation, so their rental costs absolutely surged as inflation rose to very high levels in the various cost of living crises caused by COVID and global instability like the war in Ukraine. As well as affecting NCP's leases, energy costs skyrocketed at the same time, hitting the costs that NCP had to pay for lighting, machinery, ticket systems, and ventilation. For a business that was built on predictable volume and stable costs, this combination was absolutely crippling, especially as tumbling demand for parking spaces and falling disposable income made it almost impossible for the company to pass these cost rises onto NCP's customers. So all of these economic issues were very tough for NCP to deal with. Social issues within PESTEL analysis were also a major issue. Society simply changed. Remote and hybrid work slashed commuter numbers. Online shopping reduced city centre footfall. And in addition, there was a shift amongst shoppers towards out of town retail parks, which had their own free parking, further reducing the number of people parking at city centre NCP sites. These weren't temporary fluctuations, they were permanent structural changes. It's worth noting that while the pandemic accelerated these changes, these shifts had gradually been happening for many years before COVID, and NCP had never really paid that much attention to them. The final part of PESTEL that we are going to look at is technological issues, and this also didn't help NCP. Technology introduced kind of new opportunities and threats in the parking industry, and NCP really struggled with both of those. Apps, for example, made it easier for customers to compare prices and find cheaper alternatives, which was especially important to them in a cost of living crisis, when many of NCP's car parks were perceived as being very expensive. The other problem within this category that NCP faced was that cars have become heavier and wider over time. This has led to car parks like NCP either having to widen their parking spaces and therefore lose revenue, or risk spaces being too narrow to use, increasing the number of dents and scratches that customers get in the car parks, which they don't like, and leading those customers often to end up parking elsewhere. The shift towards electric vehicles also meant that an increasing chunk of drivers in the UK wanted car charging facilities, and that was something that, especially with kind of straining cash flows and aging buildings, NCP was very slow to adopt in its sites. So if we look at PESTEL as a whole, ultimately, that macro environment had become structurally quite hostile to NCP's business model, even though it had been very successful up to that point. Next up, we can consider Porter's 5 forces, which helps us look at the competitive environment of the car parking industry that NCP was part of. This will hopefully help us explain why even a dominant market player like NCP struggled. First up, we have the threat of substitutes, so alternatives to car parking companies like NCP. Ride-hailing, e-bikes, expanded bus lanes, and improved rail services offered credible alternatives to driving. And the expansion of cycling lanes in the UK across a lot of cities as well. Particularly in big cities like London and Manchester, where NCP made a lot of their income. This led to fewer people driving into the cities, and therefore fewer people parking in NCP's sites. Next, let's consider buyer power. So how significant the power of customers was on NCP's operations. Customers didn't act collectively or anything like that, but what gave customers extra power was that customers had increasing choice. There were now more and more cheaper council-run car parks. There were an increasing number of competitors with better digital experiences than NCP. And there were more and more retailers that were offering free or subsidised parking at their stores. As price sensitivity rose due to the cost of living pressures that we talked about earlier, customer loyalty fell. So that pushed customers to move to cheaper or more efficient car parks. Now, while both of those initial industry issues that we've just discussed, so customers and substitutes, were important, supplier power was perhaps the most severe issue. As we mentioned before, NCP didn't own most of its sites. Instead, it leased them from councils, private developers, airports, even hospitals. Why? Well, actually owning central urban land is really expensive. NCP long ago made the strategic decision to try and expand quickly by signing leases, rather than raising and tying up capital in property purchases. But the drawback of this rapid expansion was that it gave them long-term, inflexible leases on the car parks that they operated. Those landlords were NCP's suppliers, and they had enormous power, because as we mentioned, the leases were long-term and inflexible, and many of them were inflation-linked. So the way the leases were structured meant that NCP couldn't easily exit unprofitable sites, and as inflation rose after COVID, Unfortunately, the inflation-linked rental costs went through the roof. So high inflation turned this situation into an absolute financial trap for NCP. Finally, within Porter's five forces, we have competitive rivalry. This significantly intensified for a couple of reasons. First of all, differentiation is limited. I mean, fundamentally, a parking bay is a parking bay, meaning that price-based competition is very high. As councils and private operators increase supply, they often undercut NCP and put extra strain on the price that NCP could charge. Exit barriers for the industry, not the exit barriers in the car parks, were extremely high for NCP as well due to the contractual lease commitments that we mentioned before. Even when a site was losing money, NCP often had no choice but to keep operating it. So NCP is, if you like, a textbook example of how fixed costs and a failure to keep up with a changing market and the world around the business can absolutely devastate any organisation. So with those two models, PESTEL and five forces, that's our external analysis complete. Finally, we can look at issues surrounding the internal operations of NCP using the value chain model. There were a number of areas here again where things broke down for NCP. Operations and cost structure were a primary area where there were major issues. Because so many costs were fixed, leases, maintenance, energy, every customer who didn't park at an NCP site cut directly into profit. Eventually, cash reserves simply ran out. In addition, the aging properties that NCP leased required more and more maintenance, and the leases that they'd signed made NCP responsible for paying this. Next up within the value chain, infrastructure and kind of central decision making became a massive problem for NCP as well. NCP was burdened with about £352 million worth of debt under its Japanese owners Park24. The fixed repayments on that debt had to be made, and that added to the risks of the company because the falling revenue that they were experiencing made meeting those debt repayments increasingly difficult. Finally, the key secondary activity of technology was not the strength it should have been for NCP. Digital components such as automated barriers, apps and online booking platforms were areas where more aggressive innovation might have really helped NCP to gather data about customer habits and streamline its operations to save money. But in reality, NCP's own digital systems often failed. Its auto-pay service and its app were widely reported as being very unreliable, leading to large numbers of unwanted penalty charges for its customers and an erosion of customer trust. The NCP app was widely reported to be unreliable at times, with crashes and connection issues and problems with scanning and logging customers in. These failures had several serious consequences, such as a loss of customer trust, damaging NCP's reputation, and an increase in administrative burdens from driver appeals against parking fines. Because the information systems weren't working properly, it didn't log that people had paid for their car parks, and then traffic wardens had come along and given them penalty notices. So obviously they had then appealed these, and NCP had to put on extra staff doing extra administrative work to try and unpick all of these problems. So in the end, ironically, the information systems didn't make NCP more efficient. They ended up becoming a liability. Competitors to NCP that invested early in frictionless app-based systems overtook them very quickly. So we've looked at the internal issues the company faced with the value chain, and we've looked at the external issues they faced with PESTEL and five forces. Now, each of these tools gives us part of the picture, showing us what the problems were that NCP faced. But it's when we put them all together that we get a really clear view of the company's issues. So let's pull all these threads together. Let's look at this kind of in fundamental terms. Why did NCP collapse? There was a collapse in parking demand post-COVID, particularly in city centre and commuter locations, and that was driven by a structural shift in commuting behaviour. There were high rates of inflation, which caused huge issues for a company who'd signed agreements with inflation-linked rents, huge maintenance liabilities, and which were long-term and inflexible, which meant that they couldn't close car parks even when they became unprofitable. All of that had then been made harder to handle because of the significant debt that they had of around £352 million, and it was all compounded by falling consumer trust due to slow and problematic rollouts of information systems and apps. It's funny because really NCP's collapse looks almost predictable in hindsight when you view it through those lenses of kind of internal and external strategic analysis. So this wasn't all down to a single issue or a single bad strategic decision. It was a combination of slow adaptation to both long-term and short-term changes in the market and mounting external pressure. So I suppose the next question is, what could NCP have done to avoid this collapse? Well, speaking of hindsight, it's very easy looking back to give advice, but there were clear areas where more could perhaps have been done. First up, earlier, more aggressive lease negotiations. Given that all this structural decline began kind of during or even before COVID, NCP could have been much more proactive with engaging with its stakeholders. It could have looked at renegotiating its leases earlier using pandemic-related shocks as a bit of leverage. It could have pursued changes to kind of turnover-based rents or variable lease agreements, and identified and maybe exited unprofitable sites sooner by kind of negotiating more with its landlords. Now, you might be thinking that sounds unlikely, but in reality, many councils were already working closely with NCP, and many of them wrote off COVID-era debts to help stabilise NCP's finances. So it kind of suggests that there were windows where negotiation was possible, but NCP didn't seem to take them as far as they could have done. Next up, NCP needed to align its operations to demand to try and reduce fixed costs and maximise occupancy. Car parks with persistently low occupancy could have shifted to unstaffed, fully automated models where feasible, or they could have even considered partial closures at off-peak times to reduce running costs. The other big area that NCP could have considered was shared use agreements, where discounted parking is offered at times of typically low car park occupancy for partner organisations like nearby office blocks, shopping or leisure centres. Some competitors even gave up the unused top floors of their multi-storey car parks to create space for solar panels to earn consistent revenue. All of these approaches were adopted by more agile competitors, and they could have either lowered NCP's cost base or helped it raise income. The problem, I suppose, with doing this is it needs a lot of information. You'd have to know as NCP which car parks needed support, which local partner organisations could NCP link with for shared use agreements. NCP had an overly compact, centralised workforce, and that led to a lack of the local knowledge that was needed to answer those questions. And a lack of well-planned information systems meant that central management struggled to make these decisions quickly and accurately. Now that leads us on to the final area that NCP could have possibly done more work with to try and avoid its collapse, and that is accelerating its digital transformation. Other car park operators often use fully automated barriers that are paired with apps that undertake real-time occupancy tracking and in some cases dynamic pricing, along with loyalty rewards and subscription parking models. These systems are used as a way to gather data about the car park operator's sites, and also to raise more revenue from customers by encouraging loyalty and potentially raising prices during peak times. Now, NCP did have an app, but digital transformation isn't just bolting on technology to what you currently do. It's completely restructuring the company and how it gathers and uses data. NCP needed to gather information to help it with its key problems, which were reducing labour and transaction costs, but also trying to build insights about how customers were behaving. How long were they parking for? When do they park in different places? Which car parks were overutilised and which were underutilised? How could we then use that to increase occupancy or save money? NCP never really got to grips with the information systems that it needed to create to find that information. And because of that, it stifled its ability to make good strategic decisions, and it damaged its relationship with customers. So, to round things off, what I want to kind of look at is what the key strategic takeaways are from the NCP collapse. And I would say that NCP's story really highlights three big things. Number one, high fixed costs are dangerous. NCP had high, unavoidable lease costs and significant debt repayments. When revenue fell due to all these external shocks, the business couldn't adapt because the fixed costs just acted like a millstone. Revenue loss turned almost directly into profit and cash losses. This highlights the really vital need for a business to undertake risk management and scenario planning, where an attempt at least is made to model and plan future shocks like declining demand or rising inflation, and plan what to do in advance if they happen. NCP's reaction was just too slow to these events, and they paid the price. Now that links to our second big takeaway. Macro trends have to be monitored continuously. Things like hybrid work, EV adoption, and technological disruption were highly predictable, and they'd been happening to some degree for many years. Environmental analysis like PESTEL and Five Forces can't just be a one-off exercise or something you do every year or two. It's a constant process. As soon as these shifts were seen, NCP should have been able to hit the ground running with new strategies to deal with the risks that these things posed. Finally, digital transformation is strategic, not optional. That would be my third big takeaway from this. It's not just technology adoption for the sake of it. Firms that can shift quickly digitally by reallocating resources or using insights from the data that they've gathered and successfully create a kind of strong digital experience for their customers are much more likely to survive in the modern world. A poor digital experience like that provided by NCP is arguably no longer acceptable for many businesses. It'll actively repel customers, and it will starve the business of data about customer behavior and preferences that could be used to improve loyalty and boost income. So, we've covered a lot of ground in this case study. Let's round it off. NCP's fall shows how even established, well-known, dominant businesses can really struggle when external conditions shift and you don't pay any attention to them, fixed costs remain really rigid, and your digital capability lags behind rivals. NCP created a strategy for rapid growth, but it tied itself into very long-term inflexible leases to accomplish that. The only way that was going to work is if the market and the wider world stayed stable in the very long term as well. Nowadays, we can't seem to predict the market next year. And certainly the number of external unexpected shocks that we seem to be living through is insane at the moment. But having said that, the collapse of NCP still wasn't inevitable. With earlier technology investment, negotiation on more flexible leases, and probably much better scenario planning, the company's outcomes might have been very different. Whatever happens next to NCP, if it survives in some form, it's going to need a lot of corporate soul searching and some decisions on how to actually deal quickly with the issues that it's facing. I hope this has given you a real world demonstration of some key strategic frameworks, and I hope it's shown you how they're not just academic, they're essential tools for diagnosing risk and guiding business survival. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategy Show. If you enjoyed it or you found it useful, please follow the podcast so you won't miss any future episodes. And I'll see you next time.